Hello, everyone, and welcome to our interview with attorney פיליפ Cruz. My name is Tamar. I'll be hosting this interview. I have law education. I'm a columnist on a news website, and I've been a healthcare worker for this past decade. I'm a part of a group of lawyers, doctors, scientists, engineers, and many concerned citizens who are working relentlessly to increase access to this important issue, which פיליפ is just about to introduce to you. We're active on social media and in the Knesset, and now we're headed towards the mainstream media. So those of you who are new to this matter, let us introduce you attorney פיליפ Cruz. He is one of the most vocal voices in this matter. פיליפ, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Tamar, for the invitation. My name is פיליפ Cruze. I'm an attorney at law in Switzerland, Zurich, with my own law firm. I'm specialized in tax law, and as of late 2020, I focused on legal proceedings against unconstitutional mandates or restrictions against the population. And at the end of 2021, I started together with my team to make a criminal complaint against Swissmedic, which is the highest supreme medical safety agency for illegally authorizing medical, in particular mRNA substances. Now, in the course of all my work, I realized that the origin for the global misinformation we have seen, and most particular the origin for the COVID-19 pandemic management, was the WHO. So it raised my interest. I wanted to understand what will come, and therefore I started, together with many other great lawyers around the world and scientists, a campaign of educating people, educating members of parliaments. And here we are today.
That's excellent to hear. I wish more people were as involved as you. It would make our job much more easier. So in this interview, we basically want to discuss the changes that are being promoted by the World Health Organization. In 2 weeks, they're about to meet for the General Assembly to introduce the new changes to the IHR, which is the International Health Organization, and present the world with the pandemic treaty. Can you please address this matter and its repercussions?
Yes, absolutely. So first, it is very important to understand that there are two international treaties negotiated separately by separate teams, and they are both submitted to the World Health Assembly by end of this month, May, for adoption. And these are two distinct international treaties, whereas one of them is subject to a very privileged treatment, and these are the international health regulations. The other one is a completely new ordinary international agreement. Why is that important? Because any public health rules that will be passed by the World Health Assembly under the title of health regulations will be treated by a very privileged procedure. There's only a majority of 51% vote needed to adopt them, and ultimately they will come into force by way of an automatism 12 months after the vote, so without the involvement of national parliaments. Whereas for the treaty, there is a 2/3 majority needed in the World Health Assembly, and they can only come into force upon a national process of ratification, which usually involves national parliaments. And the reason why I point this out is because in this international health regulations, which already exist since 2005, and of course we are speaking here only about amendments to these international health regulations, they are far more than just technical standards that are agreed upon by the member states, but they contain far-reaching rules that will have an effect on people's lives on the entire planet and on the economies of the countries, and they will give to the Director General a far-reaching power ultimately that will affect our lives. And therefore, we have to talk about, in particular, about the international health regulations, and also we need to see both of these agreements together. We have to interpret the content of these two agreements together combined.
Okay, so before we talk about some of the changes that are going to be suggested, let's talk a little bit about procedure. To my understanding, they were supposed to send a draft to the countries around the world, informing us, our representative, the civilians of the world, of the changes that they were about to address in the assembly 2 weeks from today, and that procedure has not been done. The first time that the changes will be presented is in 2 weeks from today, and they are going to vote on it.
This is right. So it says clearly in the already existing international health regulations from 2005, it says there in Article 55, paragraph 2, every amendment that shall be voted upon shall be submitted to the member states 4 months in advance in the version that they can vote upon. So the first version that the member states could vote upon was submitted to the public and to the member states on the 17th of April this year. And the entire time before, we only had the version of end of November to 2022, which consisted of a compilation, of a summary of more than 300 amendments. So it was impossible for member states to exactly know what final version was the basis for their vote. And this is a violation of WHO's own rules, the IHR, as I said, Article 55, paragraph 2. And so there shall be no vote take place in violation of WHO's own rules. This is illegal. It's a violation of international law. And as I said, because these two agreements, they belong together. They are interlinked, interlocked. They refer one to each other. And therefore, there's also the new pandemic treaty that not shall be voted upon because they are interlinked. The IHR amendments, they need the treaty needs the international health regulations. And so if one of these two instruments shall not be voted upon for procedural reasons, also the vote for the new pandemic treaty shall be postponed for procedural reasons.
Can you name one or two articles that you find most dangerous to the sovereignty of the countries?
Yes, this is a wide discussion. You know, people are saying, in particular, Tedros himself, officials from the WHO, that no country will cede any sovereignty. And even prominent people from our side said it's not about sovereignty. But if you ask yourself, what is a precondition for being a sovereign state? So one of the first preconditions is to decide yourself what kind of information you will have as the basis for your decision making. So that means you must, as a state, define yourself whether you think that we have a threat from something which is called COVID-19 or not. And you must also be completely free to define whether there's a threat from certain medical substances that are passed around and there's marketing done, and whether one of these risks outweighs the other. So I come to the point and of the dogma that is referred to usually under the name of infodemics. And ultimately we see the very strong pressure to give the WHO the total control of information, the information controlled by WHO. They are the one to decide what kind of information is allowed to be spread and will be allowed to be the basis for decision making. Where do we see that? Well, we find this notion of total control of information in the international health regulations in the Annex 1. It has been moved to the Annex 1. So you see that at two instances of Annex 1. The first one is it shall be done on the intermediate public health level, which is the regional level. And if you go there into a number C, it says risk communication, including countering misinformation and disinformation. Then also you see that on the national level, which is actually the same wording. So that means that national states, member states, shall perform a control of information based on what the World Health Organization deems to find the correct information in the wider, broader context of pandemic prevention and pandemic response. And this is the most danger.
Yes, and because they're binding, basically. We are part of this IHR.
Yes, this is binding. We are not talking here about recommendations being binding, but we are talking here about member states to accept that the WHO will issue the sole valid information basis for decision making. So they are bound on this information. They are not allowed, Israel will not be allowed to call their own scientists and make a reassessment of WHO's assessment, whether it is with respect to the pathogen or it is with respect to countermeasures, in particular vaccines. They could ask their scientists, but your government would not be allowed to listen to your scientists. And I personally think this is an example of violation of the inner meaning and sense of sovereignty, because whether you're on a state level or on an individual level, what you foremost need to perform your sovereignty is free information. So that's one of the first very alarming and very frightening notions. We have a similar provision in Article 18 of the treaty, which has been watered out so that people do not immediately see that there is this concept of information control behind that. But if you then go onto the homepage of WHO, you just type in WHO infodemics, you see that all of that is already in place. And of course, we have seen a big deal of censorship since 2020, and that has been introduced with COVID-19 pandemics. But this is not the only provision that is alarming
Funny
and
you
very
mentioned
helpful.
censorship, because I've been listening to you, and what I'm hearing is they didn't give us the draft. We don't know exactly what they're going to present. We have government officials who need to decide whether or not to accept these changes, and it's so complex. How can they even understand the whole principles of it and present it to the people and for us to agree to it when there is no draft to be presented? How can they learn this material without any...
Absolutely. Yes, this is one of the first things actually we would have to say to the lawmakers. The lawmakers, also the governments, would have to understand is, well, does these rules belong into a new treaty, or are we talking about just putting up new medical simple standards? So the simple standards are the ones that should go into the international health regulations and national lawmakers should not bother about. Whereas as soon as we are talking about new rules that will have an effect on people's life, that will prejudice the decision-making process of the governments, that has to go into a total new treaty that then must be subject to a wider parliamentary debate without time pressure. And that is not the case here.
So let's assume that all these changes have been accepted by the world, they've been validated and approved. How do you see the world 5-10 years from now? Do you see any effect on freedom of movement, our medical history, which is supposed to be confidential? Do you see any damage done to these civil rights?
Absolutely, yes. We will see the past perpetuated for the future just by the fact that WHO, the Director General, will be given much more power. We have not yet mentioned his financial powers. That will be increased significantly. I refer to Article 17 of the latest version of the treaty from 22nd August this year. He will also get much more powers. If you look into the amendments to the international health regulations, there will be 3 committees. The emergency committee that existed already, the review committee that is with the purpose to review the functioning of the international health regulations, but then the implementation and compliance committee. And what I want to say, all of these committees will be subject to the free selection of the Director General, and he can select people from the industry. He can select those people who will benefit from his decisions and will also be sponsors. So he will have a lot of powers to do even more of what he did in the past. And most significantly, this is about declaring a public health emergency of international concern on a much wider basis, factual basis. We have to understand this concept of One Health, which is extremely wide, introduced by the new pandemic treaty. We see many of these consequences in the health regulations amendments. So what are we going to see? Well, we are going to see more emergencies, wider emergencies for a lesser good reason. And what we see already in the amendments to the health regulations, well, what is remaining from the potential recommendations that WHO will do? Well, if we go into Annex 6, clearly the WHO will be the #1 authority to define what kind of medical treatment, in particular what kind of vaccine, will be allowed as a precondition for people to travel. So the entire international travels will be subject to WHO's approval of certain substances, of vaccination passports, of health certificates. So in the future, we must expect that we all will be subject to an obligation to have electronic vaccination passports, electronic health certificates, the information of which will be exchanged as soon as we cross borders. And then probably this will also take place in our domestic legislation. All of that is heavily pushed under this regime of these new international health regulations. So thereby, this is already a proof that we are not talking about simple standards here. We are talking about rules that will have an effect on all of our civil liberties, the freedom to travel, the freedom to move in the first place, and not to be subject to any kind of medical treatment and everything that we have seen that went with it in the past.
And just to emphasize, all these new regulations, they can be decided by Tedros or whoever will be the next general director. And he's not elected by the countries, right? There is a committee that elects him for a certain period of time, or do the country have any say in his election?
Well, he is elected by the World Health Assembly. The last time was exactly 2 years ago for another term of 5 years. So now he can serve for 3 more years. Yes, this is sort of way their understanding of democracy. But there's such a big lobbying taking place behind the scenes, and looking at the very bad history, criminal history of the Director General Tedros, this is certainly not an example of an ordinary selection process of different candidates with different qualities. No, he was predefined, and this Tedros is a very close contact to one of the main, if not the number one main sponsor of the World Health Organization. And this is Bill Gates. And together with Gavi, they are operating in their own interest, as Bill Gates repeatedly emphasizes that one of the most profitable businesses in the world is the business with vaccines. So yes, so it is actually Tedros, one of the best friends of Bill Gates, who is in place number one. And so clearly we see the intention of having just one person to speak to for the industry, for the pandemic industry, which will sponsor World Health Organization, to then make this person perform those acts that are industry's interest, but not in the interest of the people, not in the interest of our health, quite to the detriment.
Okay, so this leads us naturally to the next question is, why do they want to increase their budget? They want to reach $30 billion a year in the future. Who is going to fund this? Is it going to come from my taxpayers' money, or we're going to have more billionaires funding this organization?
Well, certainly it will be mostly taxpayers' money that goes into the budget of WHO, because they claim that in the past only 16%, even less of their budget came from the member states. The rest had to be provided by their sponsors. So they want to increase the amount of money from the member states. But let's not forget, in the international health regulations, there are also further provisions regarding the core capacities, which means these standard materials and standard procedures that must be permanently in place to prevent pandemics from happening. Also here, we see an obligation for member states to finance these core capacities, to finance new laboratories, to finance research and development done by the industry, of course. So also there will be a much higher amount of money to be spent into this pandemic prevention, into the pandemic industry, which ultimately will benefit only the pandemic industry, but not the taxpayer.
That's quite astonishing that we are going to pay for our civil rights to be limited.
Absolutely correct, yes.
There's one thing I'm struggling with, because when the WHO was first created, it was a noble organization. It was post-World War II, the world seen a lot of pain, a lot of hunger. Here came this organization who said, I want to make sure that all the population will have access to food, to water, to health. But this organization, it didn't have any power. It was like a beauty queen saying she's going to promote world peace. But somewhere along the line, they changed their objectives, and now they want to become a big organization with a lot of power and no checks and balances. When this whole thing happened, and why are we only waking up to this now?
Well, it happened over time during the past 20 years when the producers of medical substances, in particular vaccines, realized that they could abuse the World Health Organization for promoting their ideas of having vaccine the number one countermeasure for all kinds of diseases. You have never seen the past 20, 30 years promoting the WHO natural ways of fostering and boosting our natural immune system, which we all have from nature. It's the strongest way of defending our health. No, into the contrary, WHO has become the main promoter of industrialized products. And of course, yes, it has been hijacked, as we can see already from the financing, which is openly disclosed on the homepage of WHO, where we see more than 80% is coming from parties that have an interest, business interest in sponsoring WHO, and their sponsorship is earmarked, is combined together with conditions so that the sponsors benefit from their own sponsoring. Of course, these are not only private individuals or private corporations. We see here also states, governments, but also states and governments have their business interest in it. And how could all of that come? Well, over time, WHO has its sessions, its meetings behind closed doors. We don't see that. There's no transparency. And as you correctly say, there is no supervisory power, no checks and balances here that balances out the powers, financial powers, political powers that are concentrated in the hand of one single person. And that is the Director General of the World Health Organization. And this is what we need. We need the WHO subject to supervision, to scrutiny. We must make them disclose their books, to be full transparent. What money did they receive from whom? Under which condition? Who benefited from this money? And this must take place before any new agreement is being done and concluded. First, we want to see who benefited from COVID-19, and then we want to draw the lessons, the good lessons from the past, in order to establish a system that truly protects the health of the people instead of taking it away and harming our civil liberties.
So, in your opinion, what do you think countries, elected officials, and even citizens should do to prevent this from happening?
There's just one way of prevent this from happening: to address a clear expectation from the citizens to our political representatives. Stop these two treaties and initiate a process by which we can analyze the lessons of the past. And that includes, most significantly, this pandemic profiteering. We have profiteers of this COVID-19 who made the profit of their lifetime even more. And we need to understand who pushed for this emergency to be extended and extended and extended. We need to increase pressure on our political representatives so that they increase pressure against the government. And the first thing, if we come into a situation where the lawmakers say, well, we don't want to speak about the past, well, then at least let's speak about procedural rules. Let's speak about objective procedural WHO's own rules. Article 55 of the International Health Regulations, they clearly forbid to have now a vote on international health regulations changes that were just submitted a couple of weeks ago on the 17th of April. This is an absolute no-go. You can go on to the homepage of the Global Health Responsibility Agency under the guidance of Dr. Sylvia Behrendt. She has laid out all the reasons why to object the vote to be held now. Let's have 6 months later the vote, and in between have a process of debate and of understanding. So stop the vote now by any means. This is the message.
Thank you very much. Attorney Philipp Cruz, it was nice to meet you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. It has been an honor, Tamar. Thank you.
Thank you so much.